So these generations have experienced obviously different political, social, and economic climates, and this impacts the way they think, what they value, and how they work. So we want to dive a little deeper with each of you and talk a little bit about that, specifically starting with their values. You know, if we look at these different generations that you're engaged with day in and day out, how do you see their values differing? And to start with, I'd like to start with Todd.
Well, you know, we are the result of the influences that we experienced during our formative years, okay? So that's probably early childhood through our late teens. And so we are profoundly different. And my experience shows me that boomers are very idealistic, and it's about values for that particular generation. We've got this nice mix of those that really were influential in the 60s, trying to change the world, and the 70s, now got some practical application of those ideologies. And then there was a Gen Xer generation that that were latchkey children, oftentimes struggling for survival when both parents were actively pursuing careers. And then we end up with millennials, kind of a boomerang effect, where now we have a very over-parented generation, a generation that is very much different than Gen X. Gen X, in many cases, didn't want anything to do with the boomer generation. They rejected that generation's values and many of the things that they were pursuing that were important to them. And millennials now are very, very different. They're actually listening to the older generation. And so those kind of thoughts have a great deal of influence on their values. Boomers are very career-oriented. That's utmost importance. Gen Xers, all about quality life and work balance. And millennials are ready to change the world.
So Susan, how is it similar or different in your work environment, specifically in the educational area, based on what you see?
I think that was a great summary, by the way, Todd, of what is happening across those generations. One of the things that I'm fascinated by, and it plays out in our workforce as well, is just the whole concept of how is work valued, work itself. And I think that is one of the more extreme places where you see this playing out. For example, when I think of the baby boomers, for example, they not only love work, value work, they have a hard time retiring, an extremely hard time retiring. They can't leave work. I myself can't even think ahead to retirement for myself because I don't know what on earth I would do with my life if I didn't have work in it. Many boomers, such as myself, are workaholics, plain and simply.
Yeah,
We're working all the time.
Summarized as live to work.
Exactly.
You know, so I think that's
versus work to live.
Exactly.
And you do see that played out in the various generations and age groups about how important is work to you, how important is family to you. That's always the flip side of that, and how and where you spend your time. It comes to play, and do you want time off, or would you rather be paid and just keep working? You know, I see it play out all the time.
I think actually just to summarize a little bit about this, the work and the values is, again, when you get into those boomers, it's work to live. Then you go on to the X generation and it's live to work. And then, work to live. And then millennials or nexters are interesting because it's work to achieve whatever that desired end state or lifestyle is. So they also put some boundaries on terms of what they want to achieve, and then they go as far as they have to achieve that. So it's very different in terms of those three things.
I think for millennials, it's about making impact, and really their perspective is that we want to make global impact.
Work hard, set goals, and achieve them, and then they'll be happy with it.
With a purpose.
Right.
There's got to be a purpose for it.
We also like risk reward. And they want it now. Okay.
Very immediate.
Yeah, very immediate. It's there, and all this is generalizing.
Yeah.
Because
That's a really good point.
It is generalizing, and sometimes I get irritated when I even talk about the subject. Because as I was telling Cheryl before, we've got a couple of millennials working for us, and I asked them, I always tease them about being a millennial, so I have to sit here and explain everything to you to the nth degree, and then you're going to want to do it in 5 minutes, and you expect me to reach into my wallet and pay you, for that advice. Whoop, did they get mad? And they said, okay, we might be millennials, but we're more traditionalists. We have a work ethic. We know the bottom line. We view the big picture of this company, and we know what we have to do to accomplish a means to an end. A good case study, if I could throw this on the table. About 5 years ago, I had a CEO call me who was running about an $800 million company, and he said, Jock, I just walked out of my management meeting. And I said, why, Jeff? He said, my VPs, there's 5, they're at each other's throats. So I said, Jeff, you're sitting in the corner office making the big bucks. Go on and kick some butt. Okay? And we laughed a little bit. He said, what do you think we can do? I said, what I'd like to do is send Dr. Juno over. And I said, I think what you need to do, since you have a mix, you've got somebody who's 60, you've got 40s, a couple 30s, and so on. So you had them all there, sitting around the table. So what we did with Dr. Juno is we gave them assessments, personality type assessments. And there's about 500 of those, okay? And having a PhD on our staff, there are certain ones that you know that are more credible and they're backed up with proper information. So we tested all of these people, okay? And then Chuck sat down with them and said, Cheryl, this is your personality, this is how you are, and this is how you view people, okay? So the next time you're talking to Susan and you get into a little, remember what her personality is, okay? Approach it differently, all right? And you'll find that you're going to communicate a heck of a lot better, which is basically what this is all about. And then we turn to the Xer, or the Y, and just say, this is what they want to know. I don't want a long story about why we're doing this. Give me the facts, okay, now, so I can get on with the project and we don't have all these Kimberly-Clark type meetings. Better scratch that. Okay, so it was a great experience. And they all started to work very well together. So that's
I think you bring up a really important point. We are trying to generalize in some way about these generations, but everyone's an individual. And then based on the experiences or climate, the political, social, economic, people, again, behave differently and have different desires. So we are in some degree generalizing, but we also want to think of people as individuals. And I think what's most important when we think about this is that these are things you need to understand. What you just talked about, Jock, was all about understanding your stakeholders, and regardless of what generation they are, how do you talk to them? How do you engage them? How do you respond to them? So I think that's what we're trying to do, and I would like to focus moving away from values and work into communication. I mean, so many things are changing in the world of communication right now. We have so many opportunities through technologies to communicate differently. Certain people or individuals, certain generations are more comfortable with certain modes of communication than others. And generalizing again, boomers still like that face-to-face time. They want time with their leaders. They want to see them face-to-face. They want to be able to engage them. If you look generally again at X's, they can do with face-to-face, but they're also comfortable electronically communicating, be it Twitter, be it Facebook, be it other modes of social media. Millennials almost prefer to not have that engagement. You can have a group of millennials, because we do a lot of market research with various generations, and we had a group of millennials texting while we were in groups, kind of trying to understand what they were doing, and they were texting to each other versus communicating with the market research analysts. So they all have their own ways of doing this. So how do you deal with that? I'm going to turn to you, Anjali, and just ask you, how do you do that?
I actually had an interesting conversation with my mom about this exact thing. We were in the car riding back from a client meeting, and she's like, well, have you talked with so-and-so? And I was sitting there texting the person at the time. And so I was like, yeah, they said this and that. blah, blah, blah. And she's like, well, how do you know all of this right away? And I'm like, I'm texting them right now. And she's like, I would give them a phone call. And I'm like, you waste so much time waiting for them to call you back and playing phone tag and stuff like that, whereas it's much more instantaneous when you send a text message, and people can get back to you when it's convenient for them, and a lot of times it's a lot quicker of a response, more to the point. And so in my eyes, it just saves a lot of time, but, you know, it's...
But have you also found, at least I have too, that sometimes in email or through social media, they're a little more honest and open to versus maybe the face-to-face or group discussion?
Yes, and I think also there is the problem with things getting lost in translation. You can't detect things like sarcasm and stuff like that in an email, and people misinterpret things. Things get lost, so that's definitely one thing that, you know, needs to be considered in terms of communication. But I mean, in working with different generations, we have clients where people of the founding generation don't touch email, and actually one of the sons basically controls his dad's email and responds to all of it and stuff like that, because his dad is like, I don't want anything to do with that. And he keeps telling him, Dad, you need to, you know, just to stay current and for our company to be competitive and stuff like that, you need to embrace technology at least a little bit. So, yeah, there's definitely...
How about you, Todd? Some other examples maybe from your own experience?
Well, in terms of forms of communication, it's evolving and it's creating new and interesting challenges in the workplace. With the millennials, email is dead or dying. You know, it's too formal, takes too long. And so we have other communication tools that business needs to figure out how to adopt. Okay, it's no longer really going to work to reject instant messaging. A form of texting, which is actually highly effective in the workplace for some of the reasons we mentioned. It's immediate. People will respond to a text when they will leave an email unread for a day or days. And I think the other way that the workplace has to adopt is to just flat out allow social networking communication channels to be open. It's the way the millennials, and it's creeping all the way up through Xers and boomers now. It's the way that we're effectively reaching our network. To reach your network through email is really clunky, and again, there's this delayed response. Facebook, it can be so immediate. So learn how to leverage these new tools, create parameters, manage risk and stuff are some of the new challenges that millennials are really just pushing us into. And I actually think that there's some great upside potential with some of the new tools.
It's interesting. I read a study that they said, especially if you have boomers and you want to get them more comfortable in the workplace with these types of communications, is to actually engage them in Twitter or Facebook, because there's a fun socializing engagement aspect of it, and then eventually you might get them to do more emails, but that these other forms of communication are just much easier for them too as they try to understand that whole thing.
Come on, Mark. Oh, I'm sorry.
I think a lot of millennials actually have fun and take great pride in pulling, especially boomers and beyond, into new forms of communication,
Right.
whether that's teaching them how to text and use abbreviations and interpret the language, or setting up a Facebook.
We got a client base of over 2,000 companies. And 3 or 4 years ago, we sat down and said, who are these people and how old are they? So if I know they're a boomer, I need eyeball to eyeball, okay? And if I know they're younger and I have to, I'm not going to get a response to an email, I know that, so I'll text, okay? So we've got our system set up where we can react very quickly, and I'll tell you this. Since I've called on the Xers, the Ys, the Millenniums, and some that are only 7 months pregnant, I'm waiting for that next generation to come out and talking about that. We talk to our staff about what are you running into, and here's what you need to do. Because if I want to talk to Todd or Susan, eyeball to eyeball. Now, when I go out and make a new sales call, business development, whatever you want to call it, I love the eyeball to eyeball contact. I have yet not to come back with some new business. Okay? because the person I'm talking to likes it that I'm there. They appreciate it because most of the time they're getting emails or texts. These email marketing things are driving me crazy right now. And there seems to be more lately. But the boomers like that contact. So you really have to know who you're working with going forward. And my son, or grandson, 16, came to his mother one day and said, "Mother, I need a new telephone." And she said, "Murphy," that's his first name, "why do you need a new phone?" He said, "Because I want one I can text with." And she said, "What do you need to text for?" He said, "Well, the kids all have them. They're on the school bus or at school and everything else." And she looked at him, she said, "Murphy, you're not quite ready yet." She said, "You're not getting one." And she said, "I don't want you to have strong thumbs and no social skills." Is that a point? I think it
It is a point.
It is important, definitely.
I think all of these communication forums are, and always have been, frankly, in a transition.
Exactly.
Things are coming, things are going, phasing, from one thing to the other. And I think the key, kind of knowing that we have all these generations to communicate with, knowing that there are tendencies for them to prefer methods over one another, I think it's important that we as leaders are kind of hitting on all cylinders, meaning we've got to have all of those forms in our portfolio, if you will. You may be able to communicate some things very effectively by using email. Some of it's got to be face-to-face, and you just have to do that FaceTime. I do some blogging for those that are interested in accessing that, and we do other social media things. But I think having the variety or the different opportunities to communicate in all of its forms, I think, is really what you've got to do.
And just to summarize in communication, I think it's understanding who you're talking to and what's the right form to use. But we all have mentioned not one size fits all. There's lots of opportunities to try different things, but you really should tailor it to the type of message you're trying to send, as well as who you're sending it to. So let's move on to the next topic. The next topic in this whole area is change. I mean, what is constant right now? Change. So I want to talk a little bit about how individuals in these generations deal with change, because I definitely have seen some differences in terms of their appetite and ability to actually engage with change, how they embrace it or not embrace it, and how they get through that transition to a new state.
What you need to do is sit down and say, go to lunch or have a chat over a cup of coffee and say, let's get to know each other a lot more than just passing by in the hall or sitting in on meetings. Don't learn a lot there. Let's get to know each other personally. Then I know how to approach you and you know how to approach me, and the company's the winner. Don't ever forget that the company has to be the winner or whatever your business is. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, Susan, I want to throw out a specific example. As you mentioned earlier, a lot of your leaders are in that boomer category, and knowing some of them as I do, a lot of them are change agents. They're out there trying to deal a lot with change. But how then, as changes evolve in curriculum, or changes evolve in funding situations, and you have to change, obviously, the way you run things at the school, the way you teach things, how then do millennials adapt to that? Are they flexible? Do they resist? Are they resilient? How do you feel?
Well, I think a lot of how people respond in a change, or whether it's a forced change environment or just a natural progression, is experience. Have you been through something like this before? Well, I think millennials and Xers are really generally pretty flexible, and they can adapt pretty nicely. For example, I think if they haven't had if it's a tough change, if they haven't been through a tough experience, they're a little nervous. They're a little unsure about what's coming next, or what does this all mean, type of thing. And I see maybe the boomers, the little older folks in the mix. Well, they're fairly steady about it. They've experienced it before. They kind of know what to expect. They're a little more level about it, maybe, but they're still stressed by it. They're still not easy. It's not easy for people always to deal with or accept that change is going to happen. I think as people get closer and closer to retirement, there's more and more resistance to do what I'll call big change-ups or dramatic shifts, because they're just, they get closer to a comfortable place, and it's really hard for them to shift gears all of a sudden. Whereas the millennials, I think, are much more open to say, why do we always do it this way? And usually the answer is because we've always done it that way, right?
Well, we deal a lot with conflict in the workplace and between different generations. And just generally speaking, I would say that most people are somewhat conflict avoidant. I do think that the boomer generation is definitely more resistant to change, especially in a lot of our clients that we work with. They have always done things a certain way, and it's oftentimes been very successful for them. And they have the younger generation coming in and saying, we need to look at doing it this way, we need to do this as far as technology, website development, blogging, stuff like that. And the older generation is like, well, no, we don't need to invest money in that, or blah, blah, blah. It's worked this long, and they find it very difficult to conceptualize doing things in a different way. So it becomes kind of a challenge to get them to see the value in what the younger generation is trying to do. Obviously, if things have worked that long, it's worked for a reason, but still there needs to be openness to change and growth and development.
So we've been talking for quite a while now about these differences in either generations or as individuals. So I'm sure our readers want to better understand, how do you build a cohesive workforce? You've got 4, maybe 5 different generations at work. What are the types of things that you do as leaders? And I'll turn to you, Todd, maybe first, but as leaders to build that cohesiveness when they have such different views around values, such different experiences, the what they value and how they work?
Well, I think in a work environment, boomers look at teams in a traditional way in which they're structured. It's rank and file, and a very traditional way of looking at how teams function. Let's face it, in the workplace, regardless of how it's divided up, it's somehow or another a team. Gen Xers typically don't have much time for that. It's like, hey, you know what? I want to work independently because I know I won't be bogged down. It'll take less time and I can get out the door to pursue this work-life balance objective. And millennials are all about collaboration. They're trying to figure out, how do we put a team together, not necessarily in a typical organizational structure with a hierarchy, but how do we realize synergies and put people together to make better things happen faster. So I think when you have those 3 generations in the workplace, you have to pick the best practices from each of those 3 approaches. And if innovation really is going to rely on collaboration, then great, let's do that. Gen Xers got a point. Let's not meet the issues to death.
Right.
Let's cut to the
So,
chase.
when you can match the teams,
I think they should be mixed.
okay.
Yeah. So
I
you've
read
got
some
this-
of the experts say you should have the Xers working with Xers and so on and so forth. I found that unrealistic.
Well, millennials, with this whole collaboration thing, the team can kind of start to move like an amoeba. They probably need a boomer to say, and somebody needs to eventually make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Well,
a nice
it's
organizational
interesting.
hierarchy
Right.
that complements that.
Remember the teams, the team concept
Mhm.
that everybody has to buy in?
Mhm.
Consensus?
Yeah, have you heard about it lately? Because we're in a global economy now, we haven't got time for that nonsense, where we all have to have consensus.
Mhm.
Somebody's got to bite that bullet and move ahead, right or wrong, okay? And when Susan talked about her classes and the boomers that she has in the classes, they are now realizing finally that they need to change. Now that's got to do with education, how they think, and how they communicate. And if you get a group of people in a room saying, this is how Anjali thinks, this is how Cheryl thinks, and this is why, okay? So you got to train these people how to communicate. Communicate's the key on how to work together. If you got something on your mind, get it on the table now We got 7.5 minutes to talk about it. Okay, so you're bringing in her generation. Let's get it moving, and no more CYA meetings.
But I think specifically what you're hearing from all of you as panelists is, throughout this discussion, is you need to bring the different thought processes and different values together. But as much as there's an amoeba, you still need some structure. You still need some goals and strategy to help bound it to some degree so that some of those results are driven. So we've talked about ways to be cohesive, bringing them together. But how do you make it stick? How do you eliminate or minimize the frustration within teams? And Susan's anxious to give us some so that they're effective.
Well, I think there are a couple things that are key to that cohesiveness and getting people to work together. One, as a leader, to try to keep the focus on the end game, focus on the goal, the business outcome, the strategy that you're trying to accomplish, I think is key. And that can allow for a lot of different variation in methods or approaches, or you don't have to specify all of that. The other thing that I find is incredibly important to every generation, and I'm going back to communication for just a second, I think every single generation appreciates clarity. Being very clear and concise and direct, as much as you can be, about what it is that you're trying to achieve or what your expectations are. I can't think of a generation that doesn't appreciate that in the way you lead and the way you communicate with people.
Anjali, you want to add a few things?
Yeah, one thing that I think can be very beneficial in any organization is some sort of mentoring program. And that goes for, people from the older generation as well as people from a younger generation. And especially in pairing the two with each other, the younger generation has so much to learn from the boomers, for example, just in terms of their work experiences and their job knowledge and, things that they have no idea about. And then on the flip side of that, the younger generation has so much that, they can teach boomers about technology and things that they may not be comfortable with. And so I think that there's an educational piece that goes, that can benefit both sides of it. And then it also can help create better relationships between the two, more of an understanding and appreciation for where the other person may be coming from.
So let me just, go
The
ahead.
millenniums are in a hurry. Okay, they want to get going. And the boomers, have to think about it for a little while. But the boomers have got to be trained to ask you, what are your thoughts about what we're doing here? I want to learn from you. And those would be my words. I want to learn from you. Because your technology is a couple of light years ahead of mine. And we could be missing a lot of opportunities here. So tell me what you think. And we're going to give that serious consideration. And somewhere it's going to end up in the plan. That's why I'm constantly telling. We placed more people in their 60s in the last 3 years than we have in the last 40 because they're in demand. But we also encourage them because it's so available with the technical colleges and the universities. Go pick up those courses that you need.
To be competitive.
Yes,
right.
and you need to get up to speed. And I don't care how old you are.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, and it can be like a foreign language, trying to figure
Sure.
out
Yeah.
some of that.
So let me try to just summarize at least what we're saying here. We've talked about the challenge, multiple generations at work. If you're to form cohesive teams, the types of things you'd recommend back to the readers here are making sure you have clarity on your business goals, that there's a vision out there so that they can see the end state. Try to pair them up and allow them to learn and experience from each other. Communicate. Make sure that there's clarity at all times in terms of where you are and where you're going.